So yeah, I was talking to you about practical strategies for writing Cochrane reviews to the word limit, and I thought I'd start with the same kind of blank slide that I've always faced when I sat down to write up um, uh, a systematic review. But actually, I've been a bit naughty because this isn't really a blank slide. This is, of course, the White Album covered by the Beatles. Now, if you know the work of that group, you'll know it's one of their longer albums. Um, and although there's a huge amount of effort and production that went into that album, the cover remains simple and elegant. And if you know the track listings, you'll also know that there is no long and winding road on this particular album. And that's important to remember, because in writing a Cochrane review, you'll always generate far more material than anyone will have time to read. And the real task is deciding what's important enough to go into the main release and what's going to be held back as an alternate take. So we're introducing a word limit and to Cochrane reviews for anyone that's preparing to submit their work in the next few weeks, and indeed on the 1st of July. You won't be able to submit anything to Cochrane's editorial service with more than 6,000 words in the main text for protocol and 12,000 words in the main text for the review. I'd like to thank Elizabeth Rawle for helping to put this table together. And this actually neatly illustrates the sections which count towards the word limits in protocols and review. And this really shows that it's the manuscript view, or the main text, that's the subject to the word limit. So the words contained in our standard or IMRAD sections, background, objectives, methods, results of discussion, conclusions, those are the words that's the content that counts towards the limit. Anything in data, tables, figures, supplementary materials, bibliography, and onwards, none of that could count towards the word limit. And we set word limits based on existing guidance and data. And the data presented here are medians and interquartile ranges for the number of words in reviews accepted earlier this year in Cochrane. And that median is around 12,500 words. So the 2019 handbook recommended about 10,000 words, but since then we've asked authors for a bit more information, namely to tell us a bit more about consumer involvement, equity assessment, and some of the onward reporting requirements that fall out of those things. And we also had to take into account the effect of editorial and peer review processes on word count as well. And we see between a 5 to 10% increase in word count between submission and sign off. After that, copy editing will focus on readability and accessibility. And as such, those changes, although they may change the word count, that won't actually affect, that won't be taken into account by the time the review publishes. And word count can go up and down following their involvement. Now, this is a review that I'm going to highlight some practices which I think are worth taking note of. It's a review of amyloid targeting monoclonal antibodies in Alzheimer's disease, which published a month or so ago. Now, plenty's been said about the findings, and I'm not going to unpack any more of that in my talk. But I actually wanted to show how even a 12,000 word limit would require some adjustment to accommodate to that change. And now this review only had one comparison and a fairly targeted set of outcomes, but it would still be over the limit. This column actually illustrates the distribution of words across the different sections in the amyloid review, and it's quite typical of what we see in our. As you can see, the words don't really build up in the conclusions in the abstract, the plain language summary, the methods, and abstract from the plain language summary. It's more in the methods and the results that we see the larger they account for the most amount of words in a review. But we also see that discussion sections can also increase in size as well. Now, the methods sections will reflect a requirement for demonstrating rigor, and you're going to be held to account for that. But they also host the eligibility criteria and the outcomes, and that is going to have an influence over how big reviews can really get. Now, just like an album cover, a published review is a miracle of containment. And when it comes to writing up a systematic review, you have all sorts of outputs to contend with. The most important job you have is the curation of all the detail. It needs to be accessible, but the skill is in using the main text to really convey what you need users to take from the review. Now in Cochrane, we have a to our reviews, and it's aimed at both those who are writing and reading the review. If we're not careful, that structure can become overwhelming. I've learned a lot about epidemiology and editing over the time that I've been working in Cochrane, but learning about the write-up has been a much harder journey. And it turns out that after all, I do share something with the great Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway didn't need to write up a Cochrane review to know the great and difficult truths that I think many of you will also have come to know in your time working at Cochrane, which is that writing up is really quite hard. It's hard because what you leave out is as significant as what you choose to include. And so much of what we do when we're writing up our research is organising and agonising. What goes where, what we need to convey, what editors and peer referees are going to ask us to clarify, how we summarise what we found. Word limits force us to choose what we think matters most. So when I sat down to put this presentation together, I thought about reviews that I've read, edited and written, and I've learned enough to help you write a review that someone else can follow and remember what it said. Now I'm going to give you 3 key planning strategies to help with this. One is about scope, the second is about your results, and the last one is about planning your discussion section. So firstly, the most important thing to get on top of from the outset, and the biggest driver of word count, it transpires, is scope. That's our population, comparison, and outcomes. And we need that to mirror as closely as possible the policy, the personal or practice decision that we're looking to inform through the synthesis of evidence. And that's the target of your review. The Cochrane Handbook has some useful guidance on the decisions that you need to make at protocol stage. And it also includes consideration of trade-offs between narrow and broad scope reviews. But the practical point that I want to drive here is that the PICO question is there to help you navigate the review process, but it can also become a bit of an enemy if we're not careful. So you need to be seeding this, thinking about this at the question formulation stage. It does you good to plan ahead and sketch out what you might be in for, especially when you're thinking about how to structure your analyses. So I'm going to turn to the amyloid review to illustrate something that I think many of you will be familiar with by now, which is analysis cascade. The number of analyses that you'll have in your review will always exceed the number of outcome domains that you're interested in. So for the amyloid review in total, there were 9 critical outcome domains, which in turn generated no fewer than 34 analyses. Now, there can be good reasons for this. In this case, this was about different time points, and the time horizon of the research question extends beyond days and weeks and goes into months. But the results sections will grow because of the number of comparisons and the number of analyses together. So try and factor that in when you're planning your question by focusing on the comparisons that fit most tightly under your objectives and are likely to inform that healthcare decision. Keeping your critical outcomes to a minimum, the ones that help someone trade off benefits and harms, and restricting time points to ones that help further understanding, and don't be led by what the studies present. And there, through that process, you'll end up with the target of the review, the data you collect, findings you generate, and the focus of your write-up. They should all be pointing to that policy or practice decision. Now, Leslie Choi presented slides a few months ago, so I won't repeat everything that he outlined here today. But one practical step I think his presentation reminded me of was the opportunity that you have to map out your comparisons and outcomes before you finalize your protocol. Now, this might help you to pause for breath and maybe aim a bit lower. Maybe you start thinking about more stringent triggers for undertaking subgroup analyses. You'll prioritize certain time points over others, or maybe you'll just end up having fewer outcomes to work with. The screenshot that you can see here is taken from a protocol. of prenatal administration of progestogens preventing spontaneous preterm birth. But it's not the length of the list that's important here. It's the thinking that went into deciding how to address the objectives of that particular review through the definition, comparisons, and outcomes. Now, it's worth noting here that they actually ended up lumping the placebo and no treatment control groups together, and it was useful to identify which outcomes that a subgroup was going to be most relevant to, and also how to organize different outcomes for mothers and babies as well. Now, this is something that you're going to have to negotiate through as a team. You may want to get external input if you need it, maybe convening panels of the consumers or other practitioners in the area. But you should really aim to stay on top of the data. And this is a really good strategy to help you cope with that. You need to really have a set of analyses which together help shed light on the grey area that brought you to this question in the first place. And you should aim to contain the most important results within a short list of analyses. Anything outside of that is a supporting analysis. Maybe it's an outcome that proves a mechanism of action or a further exploration of subgroup or sensitivity analysis. But the more results, the more analyses you find yourself adding, the harder it would be to collect, report, and share that information with others. If you want to influence policy and practice decisions, keep focused on the evidence that will help that process the most. This is a good way to try and do that. So that was planning analyses and planning a protocol. So let's turn to think about the results section. Now, we have PRISMA reporting standards in Cochrane, and they really direct you to include information that helps someone who's reading your review to understand what question you asked, how you answered it, what you found, and what the limitations are. So when it comes to your results, you should be thinking about the most important findings that someone will need to know to understand and be able to act on the evidence that you've got. So in Cochrane, we break our results section down, as you may know, between 3 sections. I'm going to return to the example of the amyloids review to illustrate. So our description of studies should aim to do 2 things. They should help someone reading your review to determine the applicability of the evidence. And actually, by putting this section together, it's going to help you build these insights back into your implications of practice and research, and also to assist you in writing your summary versions as well. The overview table, which came in with the focus review format a couple of years ago, is there to house detail. And actually, what was quite nice about the way they approached it in the amyloid review was how to put together a neat summary of the study designs, the settings, and the participants without necessarily overwhelming the reader. As an aside, many of the reviews that I read go into a lot of detail here about how many studies reported which particular characteristics. But actually, what I want to know is what can we tell from what's there. Completeness of reporting is actually quite useful to know where it's quite poor, but otherwise, tell me what you can about the key characteristics of the studies. We also have a section about summarizing risk of bias. And this is sometimes just a simple list of judgment, but actually what you really need to do here is think more carefully about what the main sources of bias really were and how that played into the bias assessments. Now, what I liked about what the authors did here was how they signposted to the detailed assessments and also to the display of the judgments within the forest plots. And they only needed a few paragraphs to tell me in quite broad terms about the key domains which influenced the risk of bias assessments. They didn't need to tell me everything, but they brought to my attention the most relevant details that would then link up with the grade ratings further on in the discussion section and the result. So this was an informative, high level and consistent section, and it really helps to sort of set up the next section, which is of course the results. Now, the synthesis of results section in this particular case showed good management of the analysis cascade problem, which I highlighted earlier. The scope of the review, the amyloid review, was not expansive because of the number of comparisons. But as we saw, there were a large number of analyses, and that again is related to the number of time points. So they kept the reporting of these results quite sparse, which is quite useful editorially. It means you can read them quite quickly. And anyone who's preparing a review where you need to include outcomes measured at more than one time point an approach like this is quite a neat way to keep the word count down. I've just got a few slides to work through to illustrate how I think we should be thinking about discussion sections as well. Now, I need 4 things from a discussion section. I want a brief reminder of the findings for the most important outcomes. I want to see something about the limitations of the evidence, but also your own review process. And lastly, how review findings align with what was already known before. Most discussions can get quite long because they repeat a lot of information from the results. They often can feel a bit too comprehensive, and they don't necessarily feel like a useful interpretive commentary on the question, the findings, and the implications. So when planning your discussion section, think of the first part, that summary of main results, as a way to neatly package in one place the results that you've got from your analyses. I'm jumping to a different example now of a recent review, and this is one on screening for prostate cancer. And actually it illustrates this approach quite nicely. The analyses that were separated by different sections in the results section are now very close neighbors. As you can see, in just 2 paragraphs, you can see 8 different results from 2 summary findings tables incorporated. You'll also notice there are no point estimates, no confidence intervals, nothing about the number of studies, no I-square, and not a single p-value in sight. Tick. Now that information has already been presented in the results section. So this is really about setting the scene for exploring the remaining areas of uncertainty. Now this paragraph I've actually taken from a review on aspirin to prevent colorectal cancer, but it did quite a nice job of really neatly summarizing the downgrading decisions and the drivers for them. Now you can include insights here about applicability where that is actually a sort of a restriction on the evidence, where it sort of limits what we can say about how generalizable the findings really are. But in this example, the bulk of the content comes from the downgrading decisions and as presented in the summary findings table, which is normally about risk of bias and imprecision. And they went beyond saying what was downgraded, why. They actually thought a little bit more about the mechanism through which bias was actually operating, quite elevating, and showed, I think, a certain degree of engagement with this, and showed some really considered approaches. So when we talk about limitations of the evidence, we also need to extend our thinking to how our approach could have introduced potential bias as well, so limitations of the review process. And usually authors spend quite a few words in this section emphasizing processes that actually reduce bias. For example, we talk about having a protocol, about duplicate screening and data collection. And I don't think this is where you should really be rehearsing the rigor of your approach. Actually, what the authors did quite nicely here was acknowledge that the retrieval of evidence that they made incomplete, but they actually spent more time and energy emphasizing a quite fundamental feature of the review, which was how they interpreted the effect sizes in healthy populations when considering their imprecision downgrading decisions. Now, this last section of the discussion, agreements and disagreements with other studies and reviews, is about how your review relates to other research in the neighborhood. It can be tempting to contextualize your findings by listing and summarizing and critiquing every other systematic review that's out there. But I would resist that temptation. In the aspirin review, the authors actually have listed other relevant reviews, but actually spend most energy in relation to one particular systematic review, which differentiated from theirs by the approach to follow up and how they use data from different time points. Now, you don't need to be systematic in this section or overly critical of the work of others. You just need to highlight the most important points of difference that a reader needs to know, draw their own conclusions about your research and that done by others. So here are my final thoughts. How you spend your word count depends on a few things. Firstly, you've got to get your scope right. Your review will be feasible and it will keep your write-up simpler. For those of you who are embarking on updates in the old format, converting to the new format, this is where you might want to actually spend a bit more thinking time in the planning process. So rather than see it as an opportunity to sort of do another search and incorporate any new findings, it's an opportunity to go back to your question and rethink it in light not just of the word limits, but actually rethink it in light of how relevant your review is today, how relevant your question is, which comparisons you really want to take forward, and which you can retire. Limit the analyses. Your results should really guide decisions and not rely on every single analysis that you undertook. A point about discussions. Your discussion is where you can win over a skeptical editor. If you're honest about the limitations, I just need you to keep it short, relevant, and as interesting as you can. Lastly, I thought it would be valuable to give a nod in the direction of our policy on artificial intelligence, which is available on our website. My advice to you is to consult that policy and, more importantly, formulate your ideas about what you found in your review before you think about using them or integrating them into the write-up. Peer review will find out any over-reliance on what ChatGPT makes of your finding. And that's all I had. So thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. Thank you, Toby. That was really useful. So much helpful advice in there. Thank you. We've got quite a few questions in the chat already. So we'll go through those.
Yeah.
So first of all, Susan Brunskill is asking, so there often seems to be a disconnect as to what is wanted by Cochrane as an entity and what requirements are demanded by the editorial review team within Cochrane. So from the 1st of July, when the word limits come in, will all the people in the editorial teams be working from the same checklists that have been updated with a reduction in word count? We've been trying to shorten our reviews, but we've been criticised at times for not putting information in that the editorial team want, even if elsewhere in Cochrane it's been advised not to include that information.
Okay, so let's go back and there's one practical sort of restraining bolt here, and then I'll talk a bit about the editorial process, if that's okay. So you won't be able to submit anything over 12,000 words. There's a technical block. So you will have to shorten your review beforehand to get it in. And that's why I think coming at this from the sort of the approach that I've started thinking about with this is important. It's about focusing. It's not about losing detail. It's about focusing what's in the main text. In terms of the editorial requirements, so we are making a number of changes to how we approach our editorial work, and I think it's fair to say that when we had our focus group with authors about this, we heard quite squarely that the authors were quite keen that editors took on, there was some sort of editorial responsibility that was exercised in Cochrane, whereby we would recognize where sort of where the word limit was in a review, and we were quite careful to ask authors not to add text unnecessarily. So I think to answer your question directly, Susan, yes, I think we are quite serious about trying to foster a culture where what's required from authors isn't sort of undermined or changed by what we subsequently require. And actually, it's a question of discipline, editorial discipline, as much as it is a challenge for authors to get the words in the first place. The other thing I'd say is that I think if you go around other journals, they would say 12,000 words is pretty generous. I don't think I wrote a single dissertation when I was a student that was anything close to that. So it's a recognition that we tend to have a higher reporting requirement, but also I think it is intended to focus people's attention on thinking on what matters most.
Excellent. Thanks, Toby. Okay, we've got another question from Catherine Kimber. Now, this is probably the $1 million question, to be honest. How can authors be supported?
Not NMAs.
No. How can authors be supported when they are working from a protocol that was specified before the word count limits came in? or authors who are updating a large review whose scope is already set?
Um, so protocols that are specified before. I mean, nothing stops you from prioritizing within the break. Hopefully, your protocol identified a set of really important outcomes. Are they either listed as critical outcomes or they're your summary of findings table outcomes? I think a review that honestly tackles those outcomes and seeks to collect data on your most important outcomes is absolutely fine. I don't have a problem with outcomes being dropped if they're not important and they're not useful in the decision making process. I wouldn't take that approach necessarily just to come in under the word count. As I say, I think there are sometimes good reason to have a large number of comparisons, but there isn't always a good reason to include all that information in the main text. And I think you're going to have to at some point identify the best way to surface the most useful comparisons and the most useful analyses that help address the objectives of your protocol. I have some sympathy. I think but I also you have to try and prioritize not just the author experience, but also thinking about the user and reader experience as well. In terms of updates, I acknowledged it somewhat in that last slide, but if you're kind of midway through that process already, I think the same kind of principle applies, and it may be that you have to end up removing text that relates to certain comparisons if they're not that useful, not that important. And it may be that you've got to look at shortening a discussion section, shortening a conclusion section to help with that as well.
Thanks, Toby. Okay, so we've got a question from Mukesh. Do you recommend using the Robust checklist as a means of identifying bias in the review before submitting the manuscript? I think Robust is quite a new risk of bias tool. I understand this is not needed for Cochrane reviews, but if we choose to do so, do you recommend writing a paragraph about it? Is that better for transparency or does it add to the confusion?
Well, I wonder if I planted this question because I'm an author of the Robust paper. So I would say you don't need to do it. I think it might be useful to sort of consult it, but I wouldn't necessarily integrate it into the process.
Right, thanks, Toby. Okay, a follow-up question from Susan. If we want to make changes to the update in light of your comments today, will the changes need to be checked and approved by Cochrane before updating happens?
I'm trying to think about where that would be in the process. I assume that's before the update's undertaken. Is that correct? Maybe it is. I'll assume it is. So if that's happening before the update's initiated, you have to propose an update these days, and we've got a framework to help people navigate some of those decisions, which is the framework for updating a review. And actually, the outcome of that could be that you start with a new protocol. It could be that you continue to update that review, or it could be that you actually don't update the review because it's not worthwhile just yet. Either way, I would always make the proposal incorporate that change into the proposal to update the review, because that's a really helpful way, I think, of signaling to us what your intentions are with kind of scope management. And we'd always encourage you to think quite carefully about which comparisons survive into the updating process and which ones are new, because the target, that sort of grey area, the uncertainty, should hopefully shift over time as the evidence base matures and studies are done, which hopefully help to complete the picture from the comparisons in previous versions. But I don't think it's a straightforward process. I think it is a somewhat iterative.
Thanks, Toby. Okay, so there was a question from Yepe about where you can see a word count, but Ben Ridley, thanks Ben, has helpfully answered that with a reference to the RevMan knowledge base. Um, okay, and another question now from Louise. Why are we spending so much of the word count on the methods? These have been published in protocols and previous versions. Surely these can be moved into the appendices where they can, sorry, move them to the appendices where they can remain detailed. And then we have differences between protocol and review in the manuscript, alongside other important points unique to this version. Yeah, I guess that's similar. Some research papers these days put the methods last, don't they, after
Yeah.
all the results and conclusions. I guess that's a similar kind of, would be kind of
It
similar.
is, yeah, it is. So I mean, it's it's quasi radical, isn't it? I mean, but it's one that I think we may take that idea forward. I would think right now it doesn't feel like that many people are ready to dip their toe into that reservoir. But I feel that there may come a point where we actually start engaging a bit more with the differences between the protocol and the review, and as Louisa said, having a different approach. But I think the the thing that can grow, yeah, method sections can grow, but they're not only about the data collection bit, as alluded to. It's also about the eligibility criteria, and I think that's a useful way. It's a useful structure to retain into the review, even if it's innately clear to you. It might not be innately clear to other people who won't have necessarily the wherewithal to access other bits of the review. I think we can sort of overplay the supplementary files here. I think there is some value in sort of having that structure kind of baked in to that eligibility criteria, because that's how, you know, when readers are looking through, that's how they're gonna work through it. People don't have huge amounts of time to kind of explore lots of detailed bits elsewhere. So I think some discipline in the main text for now is where the consensus is.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Okay, so we have another question from Mukesh. So the same as using Robust for self-appraisal of methods, do you recommend adding Prisma P and Prisma S checklists to show our completion of processes according to the available standards?
I'm not sure they'd add much, to be honest, um, because those are resources that are great for authors and they're helpful editorially. I don't necessarily think that's a useful addition to a review, to be honest.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got just two more questions, but please do put any more questions in the chat. We've still got time. Question from Elena. Thanks, Toby. Great tips. For updates, would you recommend moving less relevant comparisons, subgroups, etc., to supplementary materials, or would you recommend removing them altogether?
I think it's fine to remove them all. Honestly, I feel that I don't think we do this enough. We're not I don't think it's necessarily brave. I think it's about choosing what's relevant. And I think when we create new comparisons, we've got to be, presumably that's an acknowledgement that there's some relevance to it. It could be a novel therapy. It may be that there's some exploration of dose that wasn't there in the previous version. But I always feel that adding comparisons for relevance needs to be also kind of balanced against what was no longer useful, because we're talking about updating a review. The chances are it's going to be 3-4 years old already, but you may be talking about a review that goes back even further, and the protocol for that particular review may have been conceived 15, 20, 25 years ago. Not unusual. So the question you've got to ask is, if we were doing this review from scratch now, what question would we be asking? And actually from there, what comparisons would most usefully address that question. And actually there that leaves you with, well, what comparisons do we no longer think are useful? Otherwise you're just it's kind of it's ballast, it's dead weight in a review that's gonna get in the way of other things which are more useful.
Mm, great, thank you. Okay, and another question from yeah, okay, sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Uh, how about the very boring and repetitive results section? Is it acceptable not to describe all your results? I suppose there is a tradition on how to report results, and if this is no longer the preferred way to report it, that would be very helpful. Um, I think with a new template or a model review rather than just inserting a block. Um, yeah, sorry, that's that. I'm not entirely sure what the last part of the question means, but
Okay, but do you have to report every result? I mean, editorially there is a rule about this, which is if you've got a result, you should report it. The question I have to ask is if your results are boring, are the main is it because the main findings are not that exciting, or is it that this is just lots of text? If it's lots of text, think about scope. And I you know, results that feel like they're dragging down a results section, if they're not useful, I would question whether they should be in the review at all.
mm, thanks, Toby. Okay, so there's a question from Liz Dooley. Um, so for updates that are closer to publication that have been peer reviewed, it's a tricky thing to ask authors to cut down the text at this late stage. Will the central editorial service suggest which text should be deleted?
I think we're not thinking about reviews that are already in process. I think they have a pass basically for now, so we shouldn't. I mean, I agree. I don't think we would want to foist changes on people during that particular process, which wouldn't have applied. It's like retrospective application of a law. There's a statute of limitations here. I think anything that was submitted before the 1st of July should get a pass.
Mm. Thanks. Okay, and Elizabeth Royal from the copy edit team has made a useful point. She says, please note there is limited capacity to exceed word limits during the copy edit stage for the sake of accessibility and readability. So please do not worry if copy editors ask you to include a little extra detail here and there. That will not be a problem. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay. So yeah, and Elizabeth's also confirming that reviews that have already been submitted are not subject to the word limits.
Statute of limitations.
Thanks, Elizabeth, again. Okay. A point from Catherine Kimber. Thinking about scope is not helpful advice when the scope was set by a protocol already submitted and reviewed. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Toby.
Look, I think you're not married to a protocol. It's there to help you with the review. It's there to, yes, it is a public record of what your intentions were, but it's not fixed. And I mean, I think I'm happy to see a well argued justification for a change to a protocol that actually is about making the answer more relevant to users. And we should all actually, I don't think that matters, to be honest. I think if your protocol lists loads of outcomes, again, I'm thinking about, well, unless you were strong armed into having 15 outcomes, I think you've got to start thinking about what the most sensible approach to analysis is. If you're at the stage where you're collecting data, you've got your data collection form set up, you may have, this may be the wrong time to hear some of this advice, and nevertheless I still think that outcomes that aren't useful, comparisons that aren't relevant, I don't think I think that it's perfectly reasonable to justify a change between a protocol and review that's made on that basis, that's made in good faith, uh, and that is essentially about refining the target of the review question. I acknowledge it's hard, but scope's always been hard. It's been hard for 30 years. And I would say that you know the thinking that example I showed of the gestogen review, that was an iterative process that happened during protocol development. But is there a reason why you couldn't think about rationalizing your analysis now? I mean, if you've got your summary of findings table outcomes defined, you've collected data for them. Is there a reason why you couldn't focus just on those?
Thanks, Toby. Okay, we've got more questions and points coming in. Um, so question from Louise. I find the issue is how overly prescriptive Cochrane is in the write-up. And she says we manage detailed reviews in 6,000 words for other journals all the time. So yeah,
Yeah.
is Cochrane
Okay.
prescriptive?
That's not for me to say. I mean, it's mainly the experience that you've had is simply that other journals have they have a much tighter limit, and you're able to do it. You use supplementary files. Um, we do have a high reporting requirement compared with others, and that is why when I was putting that that word limit together, I just thought 12,000 is quite a lot actually. And then I looked at the data and I was like, well, actually it's below the median. So quite a few review teams are going to have to show some restraint in certain parts of the review. Um, Maybe we are a bit too prescriptive, but that doesn't mean to say that you could do a review in comfortably under 12,000. The aspirin review is quite a nice example of a review that was done in less than 9,000 words, and they still covered the bases they need to cover.
Mm, Thanks, Toby. Okay. Elizabeth Royals clarified the statute of limitations um, rule. So thanks again. And then we've got a point from Josie Sandercock. Um, so she says the word limit is too low is not a well argued justification for changing a protocol.
I agree. I think. I mean, when I was thinking about this presentation, I I I thought, God, it's so boring talking about word limits, and actually, it's a bit more interesting to talk about writing. But writing's hard. But also, maybe the thing to emphasize with all of this is every bit of the review process needs a bit of thought and planning. And we've known that for protocols. We know that for data collection forms. We know that for structuring your analyses. But the write-up actually needs a bit of planning and thought as well. And although that won't remove all the heartache and all the difficulty, as Ernest Hemingway said, you sit at a typewriter and bleed. Um, I also think that I think I'm seeing some discussion sections and certain sections of reviews being written in collaboration with AI, and I think it's worth thinking about how you might use that in the context of word count, word spend, because some of those tools can actually help shorten, summarize, refine, as long as you own sort of the intellectual content, the ideas that stand behind it. And that's why I put that reference into the AI policy in the end. So a transparent declaration that you've used AI, I think, is entirely in keeping with that policy.
Mm, Thank you. Okay, we've got Louise makes a point. Our reporting does not fall off with other journals, but we have much shorter methods and results, and we put much more in the appendices and we reference them. Readers are well able to access appendix.
Yeah. I mean, that may well be a direction that Cochrane ends up going in, but it's not where we are right now.
Yeah. Okay. And a question about network meta-analysis.
It came up in the end. Yeah.
So how will NMAs, network meta-analyses, and reviews looking across the scope of possible interventions be conducted now? And these types of reviews necessarily have multiple comparisons.
So they should have one synthesis though, or at least they have networks. I don't know. I think are we talking about we're not talking about reviews with endless comparisons. It's endless nodes, essentially. And I rather like the idea that I've seen presented before about full set and decision set analyses, and actually using the text to convey the most useful sort of comparisons is actually a neat way of, I think, trying to get over the sort of how many comparisons and how many results do you have to put in. So having a sort of thinking about sort of the most useful competing medicines or useful competing interventions in an area rather than the full set of the analysis. I think I've seen names from authors. I'm aware of at least one massive NMA who are here today, and I think it may be that this is the word limit that is going to be difficult to meet. We can make exceptions, but I want them to be exceptional rather than a rule. And I think there's still some scope to make NMAs come in under that limit, but it might be a bit harder. I accept.
So from Louise, I fear the suggestion of limiting scope to reduce word count, and the general direction with how analyses are set up in RevMan Web now. I think that this means that Cochrane is heading to rapid reviews only.
Okay, so I don't think we are heading to rapid reviews only. I think that there's plenty of scope for systematic reviews being done in Cochrane. That's the first point. The second point is I think, yeah, I'd far rather think about scope in terms of usefulness than word limits. It fits under this topic because, what drives word limit, what drives word count in a review, and its scope, its comparisons. And actually, it's not just about writing fewer words, it's about making the process a bit more straightforward from an authoring perspective, from an editing perspective, and actually ultimately from a user's perspective as well. So I don't want you to leave this webinar thinking he was going on about scope to reduce word count. I was going on about scope to think about usefulness. Word limits force a choice around what content we put in the text and what we leave out. But scope is how you kind of translate your objectives to something that's helps you manage the process. And my advice is keep your scope as manageable as you can. Because actually, it's not about doing reviews rapidly, it's about doing systematic reviews well and quickly and efficiently. And to do that, I think you do have to think carefully about which comparisons matter most, which outcomes matter most. Because it shouldn't be an endless list. That's sort of 2003 kind of approach to it all, to be honest. That's, tells you my age, but I think it's really a question of trying to kind of marry the scope to the comparison that most usefully going to generate evidence that informs the decisions. and word count is just a way of maybe forcing this conversation.
Josie said, if it's not about reducing scope to reduce word limit, why is there a word limit? Why not reduce the repetitive narratives required in the text and accept the number of words required to report the review?
Why did we introduce a word limit? We introduced a word limit because I think if we don't have a word limit, we'll end up with reviews of 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 words. They're really difficult to edit. They're really difficult to get referees to look at. They're difficult to copy edit. They're difficult to read. And also they're difficult to update. So we had to come in. I think it was right that we came in somewhere. Every other publishing either organization that publishes or journals, they have a word limit, and it's far lower than what Cochrane does. And I'm keen not to sort of preserve will accept any word limit or any word count, sorry, in a review. I think we have to be a bit more disciplined about how we spend resources editorially. And I think, but yeah, being repetitive is a bit boring. That's why with some of the examples, actually, it was how they approached reporting and writing that I think reduced the degree of repetition.
Okay, thanks so much, Toby. Okay, so I guess this is kind of the start of a conversation as well with authors, isn't it? And you know, more guidance will come out, and we'll be able to answer questions as we go along. Because obviously it's clearly an important and topic that people have different views about.